Collins & Co invite you to join us for our regular lunchtime not-for-profit seminars and workshops. In these sessions, guest speakers deliver expert knowledge on topics specifically catered for the not-for-profit sector. Sessions are held at Collins & Co from 12 till 2 and lunch is provided. Contact Collins & Co to find out the next seminar topic and to register.
Hi there, I'm Angela Rutter from Common Cause Australia. Today we're going to be talking about values and frames for creating a better world, and we're going to be looking at the circumflex and the work of Professor Shalom Schwartz as a start. So just by way of intro, as I go through the presentation, I'll talk a little bit about my story, not because it's particularly interesting or a big sort of aha moment or anything like that, but just as it gives you context of how values, which I'm going to talk a lot about, values and frames, play out in our day-to-day lives. So the presentation will draw on an evidence-based approach which we use at Common Cause, but also talk to specific experiences so that you can start to see and think about how values and frames actually manifest in our day-to-day world. And I believe the presentation, it's up on, is it up on the other screen or just the one screen? It is up on both screens, great, okay, so I might sort of toggle a bit between them. So we're going to be looking at values and frames, and crucially that motivate change, because we're all, I guess, I assume in this room everyone is here looking to create a better world. My journey to that particular space has been fairly mixed. So I actually studied marketing at university because I've always been interested in what it is that makes people tick, which then took me into advertising. And through a series of small epiphanies, I came to the decision that I actually needed to seriously change direction and work in a space that was much more aligned with my values. And I was lucky enough to find my way to the Australian Conservation Foundation, where I had a number of roles, one initially leading a climate change leadership program, which came out of Al Gore's An Inconvenient Truth, and then more recently as Director of Engagement, where we actually implemented a values-based approach to our engagement activity. So there's some examples that I'll talk to you as we go through, but I guess when I sort of think about what are my values and where do they come from, one of the things that springs to mind is my mum. And as a kid of the 70s and 80s, we used to do this thing where we'd go for a Sunday drive, which I think was a fairly popular sport at that time. And we'd go out into, we lived in Yallambee, which is just near Heidelberg, and we'd go out into the country. So we'd go out into Doreen and Yarrambat and out Whittlesea Way, what was then countryside. And my mum, who grew up on a farm in Queensland, and also who paints, as in paints pictures, she used to talk to us, my brother and I, about the beautiful landscape. So she'd talk to us about the ribbon bark of the river red gums, and she'd talk to us about how the wind would move through the grass and you could see it running. And she'd call out the beautiful blue mountains in the distance. And what I realise now that Mum was doing was actually priming me, priming my intrinsic values, my love of nature, beauty of place, love of connection, all sorts of things that she actually instilled through those multiple car journeys that we have. And one of the things I only just found out was not just how powerful that was for me, but also how powerful that was for a friend of mine who often used to stay overnight. So she would be in the middle seat in the back and listening to my mum talking about all these things. And she said the other day to me that she actually now talks to her kids in the same way, that she finds herself commenting as they're driving through different parts of country about the beauty of what's around them. So more recently, so in 2007, 2008, when I was working at the Australian Conservation Foundation and working on climate change, that really, I guess, was the moment where the role of values really came to the fore for me and introduced me essentially to Common Cause and a lot of work that had been done in the UK. And what was happening at that time was, I don't know if people remember this, but when Kevin Rudd was Prime Minister, he actually called climate change the greatest moral challenge of our time. So he really spoke to the significance of it, the collective nature of it, and the importance of leadership. And quite soon after, we were in a position where we had a campaign that was actually initiated by a whole range of social justice and environmental groups to support a carbon price, a price on carbon. And we launched a campaign where Kate Blanchett and Michael Caton and others were fronting up the campaign. And I'll talk about this a bit more in a tick, but we went very quickly from a conversation about a great moral challenge to a hip pocket conversation, and there actually was no discussion of motivation for why we're doing this other than the cost that it was going to cost each individual person. And at that time I was actually reading a report called Common Cause, the Case for Working with Our Cultural Values, which Tom Crompton had authored with a range of other people. And I was lying on my couch reading this report and thinking, oh my gosh, this is exactly what's just happened to us on environmental issues. It's exactly what we were seeing on asylum seeker and immigration debates and discussion. And it really got me thinking about the fact that we were having a conversation about an issue, but actually we're really having a conversation about the values that we hold and the type of society. It just happened to be channeled through a particular issue, which happens quite frequently. So I contacted Tom and he very kindly said, what can we do to support you? And it turned out there were a whole range of other people within this country that have also been reading that report and thinking about the significance of that in creating a better world for all living things. So Common Cause is really about our motivational system. So we're looking at what are the values that sit at the heart of our motivational system and how does that result in terms of the attitudes and behaviours that we derive. It builds on some work that was done by a gentleman by the name of Shalom Schwartz, Professor Shalom Schwartz, and he was actually building on some work that was done in the, I think, the late 70s, early 80s by Herman Rokeach. And what Schwartz did is he basically took the common values that Rokeach had found and started to build them across a whole range of cultures and countries and look at what are the common values that sit across these different cultures and countries and plotted them. So he basically found that firstly we all hold a whole range of common values. So there's about, I think, 58 values that was initially identified across 57 countries and it's since been built into a much greater number. So he found that there's these common values, but also that the values have a relationship to each other. So what you see as sitting close together in terms of the dot mark are actually values that relate and reinforce and connect. And it follows also that those that are sitting further apart have an antagonistic relationship to each other. So Schwartz basically started looking at all of these common values that we have and looking at them in terms of the different clusters. So what we end up with is a cluster of 10 different segments identifying these different values. So if you start at the top, you've got universalism, which is very much around bigger than self. So all of these ones here are much more sort of bigger than self associated values. Universalism, benevolence, tradition, conformity, security, and then power, achievement, hedonism, stimulation, and self-direction. So they're the 10 different segments. And there's also, you may well be familiar with these terms, intrinsic and extrinsic approaches. So one of the axes that actually runs across this chart is an intrinsic and extrinsic axis. So extrinsic values tend to be values that are more associated with concern for yourself and much more to do with things like status, social recognition, etc. So when I was working in advertising, for instance, we were really targeting these values essentially, even though we might not express it in the same way, but very much about looking for outward approval, those type of things. Intrinsic values, which come across here, are associated with concern for things bigger than self. So it might be your community, it might be other living things. It tends to be bigger than self issues and attitudes. And you will see in here, hopefully, you can read it okay, you'll see things like unity with nature, wisdom, true friendship, helpfulness, creativity, curiosity. So they are your more intrinsic values. So this circumflex starts to demonstrate the 10 different clusters. So you've got one of the axes here, which is the intrinsic extrinsic axis, and then you also have another axis which runs across here, which I won't talk too much about, but it's interesting to know because it refers to openness to change, and it's called conservation, but not in the environmental sense, but as in retaining the status quo, so conserving status. And when you start to think about this particular axis and what that means, and if you start to think about some of the public discussions that are happening, what's running in the public discourse, this axis actually comes into play quite a bit in terms of, one example is often what you'll hear through the media, what you might hear political leaders saying. So as we go through this, you can have a think about where some of those conversations are actually ending up. So why values matter? So values are at the heart of our motivational system, and they're linked to our goals and also our attitudes and behaviours. And what this means are things like how nationalistic we are, things like how much we walk or cycle, things like what we eat, how empathetic we are, how much we volunteer. So high rates of volunteering, for instance, are indications of high intrinsic values. Things like our attitudes towards human rights, our attitudes towards immigration, our attitudes towards gay rights are all linked to our values. So in terms of our dominant values, what do you think are the dominant values of our society? So I'll just read some of these out and you can have a think about it. So we have universalism, which is about understanding, appreciating, tolerance and protection for the welfare of all people and nature. Benevolence, which is about preservation and enhancement of the welfare of people with whom one is in frequent personal contact. Tradition, which is about respect, commitment, acceptance of the customs and ideas. Conformity, which is restraint of actions, inclinations, impulses. Security, which is about safety, harmony, stability of society, of relationships and self. Power, which is about social status and prestige, control or dominance over people and resources. So it's power over, not power to. Achievement, personal success through demonstrating competence according to social standards. Hedonism, which is about pleasure and sensuous gratification for oneself. Stimulation is about excitement, novelty and challenge. And self-direction is about independent thought and action, choosing creativity and exploring. So no right or wrong answers here, but I just want to go round and everyone just say, what do you think is likely to be one of the most dominant values of the Australian society?
I'd like to think universalism, but I don't think it probably is.
What do you think it is?
Maybe power.
Power? Yep.
I think it depends on the generation. I think hedonism is quite huge in the younger generations.
I'm actually thinking security.
I would have said hedonism or stimulation.
I would have thought security. I was probably thinking security.
Yep.
Yeah, I thought security and power.
I thought achievement. Oh, I thought security and achievement.
Yeah, I'd say achievement and conformity.
Security.
Achievement and security.
Security and stimulation.
Security and achievement.
Okay. So most of you are saying somewhere around here. So achievement, power, security. So I was hearing. So it might surprise you to learn. You probably can't read these at all, can you? Okay, so top of the pops, we have benevolence and universalism, and then security, and then self-direction, conformity, tradition. Down the bottom is power, stimulation and achievement. Now, the thing that's quite interesting with this, and I'll show you another chart in a minute, but what is interesting is typically across cultures, universalism and benevolence is number 1 and 2. So in all the different countries and cultures that this has been run in, that is consistently number 1 and 2. And you tend to find self-direction and universalism 2 and 3. So benevolence is generally number 1, self-direction or universalism 2 or 3. So I think there's a really interesting question for Australian society that security is actually quite high, and what that might be doing in terms of how we respond to some of the questions and issues. So in terms of the international values, so this is basically a chart that's looking at the intrinsic and extrinsic values. So it's showing that in all of these countries, the intrinsic values index higher than the extrinsic values. So to my point before about in a whole range of different countries and cultures, actually what is most dominant is people prioritise intrinsic values over extrinsic values.
Can I just ask how that's measured?
Yeah, so it's a statistical survey, and it's repeated. So the one before the World Values Survey has been running over a period of time. I think it's 20 or 30 years. So it's continually measured. And these are all standardised surveys that they use. So they, I'll come on to some other research in a minute, but they basically take into account what people might claim as opposed to what people are. So the ones that are actually lowest on the intrinsic values are Rwanda, Tunisia, Nigeria, Zimbabwe. So what do you notice about all those countries?
Very unstable.
Exactly, highly unstable countries and probably very strong security and threat running. So that would explain part of that. But interestingly, the vast majority of countries are more intrinsically orientated. But there's a twist in the tail. So the twist is exactly what we have just done, is that people's perceptions are that others are generally selfish and generally more orientated towards power, achievement and security. So if you ask people what values do you prioritise, the vast majority of people will say intrinsic values. So they'll prioritise universalism, benevolence, self-direction type values. If you flip this question and say to people, what do you think others prioritise? The vast majority think others are more extrinsically orientated. So 74% of people in this particular study that was conducted in the UK prioritise compassionate values, intrinsic values over extrinsic values. When you flip the question, no, other people, 77% are more selfish, extrinsically orientated. Now we've seen this as well in Australia in a multitude of ways. Certainly the research that we're doing at the Australian Conservation Foundation bore it out as well. And this particular research, which was from CSIRO, where the question was asked about how many people believe in climate change, 23% people thought 23% of people would identify as not believing in climate change, whereas in actual fact, it's less than 8% of people who say they don't believe in climate change. So there's a really interesting challenge for us in terms of that perception gap. And my question to you is, why do you think that such a large majority of us think that other people are more selfish and prioritise extrinsic values? So what do you think it is that's creating that perception gap? Is this free?
Media artefact where we hear bad stories about everything out there all the time.
Absolutely. Who's watched the news lately? How much of that is bad news about how selfish we are, how violent we are? Yeah, what else do you think contributes to that?
I think there's a perception that negative interaction or negative thought or negative experience seems to stick with us longer. So the adage that if a customer has unsatisfactory service, they'll always complain about that. They'll tell 4 people, whereas if they have a great experience, they'll only tell 1. So perhaps there's that element of those negative experiences stick with us longer, and we don't necessarily stop and appreciate at the end of each day, well, look at all these great things that happened. It's the big negative thing that kind of sticks with us. So maybe that's part of that perception
Yeah,
as
that's
well.
an interesting one.
We're
Other thoughts?
tribal.
Tribal?
So we stick in our groups, so we don't move outside those groups very often, so there's always another. So, once you've always got another, you've got something to kind of bound up against.
Yeah, so if you often will hear the sort of otherising that happens through our discourse. So that social dominance orientation engages very much extrinsic values. So we'll engage either fear, so that fight and flight response, which will push people more into the extrinsic value space, close people down. So rather than being open to change, we'll close people down. Other thoughts?
Politics.
Yeah.
Maybe that the change that people want to see is slow to occur, or it's not occurring because of power interests that are happening through politics.
Absolutely, yeah. And are people on Facebook? Yeah, so I don't know if you get similar things coming through on Facebook, but you know, sometimes I'll get a video of someone saving a puppy or something like that, and invariably in the comments there's always someone that says, oh, thank goodness there are still good people in the world. So you know, this idea that good people are actually a minority amongst us and the world is predominantly a dangerous and violent place. Which I'm not suggesting that that isn't a reality as well, but what I am saying is that it contributes to this idea of how we perceive one another. And also, if you're thinking about the type of programs you might be designing or the type of interventions you're looking at, if we're starting from an idea that people are selfish and people are extrinsically orientated, then that actually affects how we think about those different interventions quite significantly. Whereas if you actually start from the point that people are over here, you end up with very different solutions and different ways of approaching things. So I'll just talk a bit about priming. So in terms of values activation, there's two sorts of modes, if you like. So one is the disposition that we have, and the other is the context. So the different contexts that we experience actually activate different values. So we just talked before about the media. So that is an example of, you know, I might be my disposition might be much more intrinsically orientated, but if you're in a constant context where security and fear and threat is being primed, it's going to bring those to the fore for you. So a few things to remember with that Schwartz diagram. One is the spillover effect. So if you're engaging the intrinsic values, you know, whether it's a benevolence, self-direction, etc., is that those values that are associated with each other spill over and activate other values. And the same is true all around the circumflex. So if, for instance, you were looking at activating the extrinsic values, you know, if you're going to activate ambition, you're likely to spill over into successfulness, capability, influential, social recognition. So it's same is true the whole way around. Then there's also what is called a seesaw effect, which is where you activate one set and it suppresses the opposites. So if you think back to that original dot diagram, you know, the values that you're activating over here are going to actually suppress those over here, and the same is true in reverse. So for instance, if you're activating values around protecting the environment or a world of beauty, like what my mum was doing in the car, unity with nature, etc., you're actually going to suppress values that are more associated with hedonistic and achievement orientations. So one of the easiest ways to think about this is, you know, what are the motivations that you're tapping into? And if you look at the media as a great one, you know, you can look at often an article and see really clearly the sort of values that they're activating and the sort of frames that they're activating to elicit particular motivations and attitudes. So here's an example of a study that was done which is looking at helpfulness. So they had 94 participants and they split them into 3 groups. And they asked people to list reasons for and against honesty and loyalty. And also, and then the other group to list reasons for and against successfulness and ambition. And then there was a control group. So group 1 was honesty and loyalty, group 2, successfulness and ambition, and the third one was the control group. And the real test was when they came in to see the research assistant to sign out or whatever it was, there was a box full of pencils and they got spilt every single time. Clumsy research assistant. So the real test was actually who picks up the pencils after they had done these priming tests. So one group is primed on successfulness and ambition. The other group is primed on honesty and loyalty. But what we're looking to see is the behaviour of, do people pick up the pencils when someone else knocks them over? So what do you think happens?
The people who've been thinking about working honestly with the pencils, being given the numbers and the others.
Yes, exactly.
And they probably didn't start off like that.
Yeah, so in terms of the recruitment and all of that, you're recruiting for the same disposition the whole way through. So who can see where helpfulness is? Yeah, there it is. So it's right next door. So that's an example of the spillover effect that's happening, and then also the seesaw effect that is going on. And just in a really contained example and a very specific behaviour. So let's talk a little bit about framing. So framing is really looking at how you encourage particular ways of making sense of things. So framing is right throughout our conversations in a whole range of different forms and formats. So this is taken from a report that Common Cause in the UK did called Common Cause for Nature. And they identified a range of different frames that commonly appear in environmental communications. And they're actually quite common throughout a whole range of different communications. So the intrinsic frames that they looked at were connection with nature, nature is beautiful, discovery and exploration, and working together. So this idea of joint action and cooperation as opposed to individualism. And then the extrinsic frames they identified are about transaction and consumers. So this comes out when we identify people as consumers as opposed to citizens, so placing people in an economic frame. One of the things that we do is consume, but we're not consumers. Utility and commodity, so money is the main focus and as a mean of valuation. So, for instance, if the purpose for doing something is to grow the economy or for the economy, that is really sitting strongly in a money, utility and commodity frame. And defender and threat. So you see this quite a bit as well, which is about powerful defenders protecting the weak. So using language that motivates a sense of threat or fear. So they will typically engage the extrinsic values, and therefore people close in more. So I was strolling along one day just outside Melbourne Central Station, and there were all these little tags on the plane trees. And these tags said on this whole row of plane trees, the trees in this street will give back $10,613.80 worth of environmental benefits over the next 20 years. So what do you think is going on in terms of the frames of that particular communication? Which frame do you think they're appealing to?
Utility and commodity.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, I suspect the brief for this was probably about trees have value in urban environments. The way in which value has been interpreted in this context is actually monetary value, that their purpose is monetary value. So if you think back to that the values map, where you have the intrinsic values and then the extrinsic values, actually where they are is right here. And these values are an opposite to protecting the environment and unity with nature and a world of beauty that are associated with concern for nature. So what they're doing inadvertently, even though they're probably setting out with completely the right intention, is they're actually promoting and encouraging and strengthening values that actually don't serve the purpose of protecting the environment. Does that make sense to people? Yeah.
Is it possible that they were trying to appeal to the financial controller of Melbourne City Council or something to, like, that there are certain people, and politics seem to always come back to this. So the cost of bullying, the cost.
Yeah, so there's two arguments for that. One is it's not only the financial controller that sees this, so it actually normalises a broader perception. So when you go back to that perception gap, it actually creates this idea that, oh, that's all people do care about is how much the tree is worth and what it gives to us. And then the other piece is, again, if we're putting people in that consumer frame, it starts to amplify the extrinsic values. Whereas if you're putting people in a citizen frame and creating a sense that we are bigger than what I care about for me, you're actually building connection and building motivation for a much broader range of issues and behaviours. So for instance, the self-direction values, which are up here, are more typically associated with civic advocacy, for instance. So, you know, engaging with your local MP, you know, maybe signing petitions, things like that. Whereas down here, which is much more about the security orientation, people are not going to engage in that sort of behaviour. The other challenge around, because it is, you see it everywhere, like it is absolutely everywhere where, you know, everything is quantified in terms of the dollar cost. It then narrows completely how you talk about value. So if it's one component, even then I think it's challenging, but you know, there's ways that you can do it, but it's what is the motivation for protecting. It's not about just fueling the economy or providing a cost benefit. So quite recently, I think it was last year, must have been the start of last year, there was a big study that came out about the Great Barrier Reef being worth $53 billion to the economy. So if you think about that, it's got the economy as the big overarching frame that we're feeding, and the reef has a dollar value for the economy. Whereas what you could say is that $53 billion of the economy depends on a vibrant, healthy reef. So you could flip it around, so actually you're talking about the reef as a living entity, a living thing, of which there's this aspect of our society that depends on it. That's not perfect, by the way, but that's the other way of thinking about things. So, when you think about consumer, what comes to mind? Just vox pop a word. Any word?
Line.
Product user. Money.
Money. Yeah.
Money.
Buy, purchase, sales.
Disposable.
Person.
User.
Imperialism.
Mm. Citizen.
I didn't know what to think. No, actually, the last one popped into my head straight away. Good.
Member of society.
Yep.
Responsible.
Choices.
Collective.
Rights.
People.
Person. Responsible.
Participant. Community.
Society.
Culture.
Belonging.
Okay, so can you see how different that is?
Yeah.
So that's an example of the frames that you hold in your head associated with those two words. So if we're repeatedly being told we're consumers, then it's activating a particular identity and particular values associated with that. If we're talking about citizens, it's quite different. And in fact, there was a study that was done in the US where they put out a survey, and the survey contents were exactly the same. The only difference was in the subject line. One was called Citizen Survey, the other was called Consumer Survey. So not surprisingly, what happens is in the follow-up test is they find that people that were primed as consumers were much more less likely to share the resources in a game that they were asked to play, less likely to be more giving, as opposed to people that were primed as the citizens. So even just simple words, they're not simple words because they have a whole lot of meaning that are attached with them, but single words, for instance, that actually change how we think and feel about things. So I don't know if people remember I think it was the first budget that Joe Hockey delivered, and there was this massive sort of outcry from Australian society. And I think what was probably going on there was he had essentially tapped into our deep values of who we see ourselves as a society, even though it was through a range of different issues. So it was on health, Medicare, environmental, tax, a whole range of different things. But actually what he was doing was really attacking essentially the values of how we see ourselves as a society, and there's such a strong...
Ange, do you think the anger was triggered by the budget content, or was it that image of him and Jez Corman smoking cigars?
I think that added to it, yes. Yes, I think that probably added to it.
Because that sent a much stronger message about what they thought.
Yeah, so that's a classic othering. You know, it's them and us, you know, this is what one in-group do and the out-group, you lot on the rest. So one of the things to keep in mind, and certainly often when we're thinking about either marketing or thinking about behaviour change or thinking about designing interventions and things like that is often we're told start where people are at, and the assumption is that where people are at is a selfish space. So think about it as we all hold all of those values and they get activated in different ways, and we can activate helpful values that are associated with broader concern for issues that are bigger than ourselves. So things that are associated with environmental concern, social concern, participation, democracy, etc. Thank you. If you'd like to know more about what Common Cause is about, feel free to get in touch. And similarly, if you want to have a look on our website for further information, we run workshops. We also do tailored workshops and things like that. So if you'd like to know more, feel free. If there is a Facebook group, but you need to search that specific term, because there is another group called Common Cause Australia, which is very, very different to what we are about. You'll spot it straight away, but yeah, you need to actually put in the full term. Thank you very much.
Anyone got questions?
Angela, how do we balance those demands when it comes to, we're an RTO, we sell a product. Our product is based on careers, employment, economic benefit, but we're a community college. We pride ourselves on community values, caring.
Yep.
Where does that common ground come from? How could you translate that?
So I think the main thing is to think about what are the motivations that you're activating in people. So for instance, there is, I didn't show it this time, but there is a study about the army, I think it's the British Army, where they promoted the army based on essentially hedonistic and achievement orientated values. So things like join the army, see the world, if you're bored of the same routine, join the army, etc. So if you think about it, the motivations that they're activating are actually not in line with the purpose of the army and what it's about. So yeah, I'd just keep thinking about what are the motivations that you're activating, and draw on those values that are associated with that, so that, yeah, if you're activating around community or if you're activating around people's broader purpose, it could be around creativity and curiosity, for instance, would be another way of doing it. But don't, the temptation is often to try and do a bit of both, that, you know, oh, if we do a little bit of this and a little bit of that, we'll kind of, you know, end up in the right spaces, or end up in the spaces that are strong in terms of building concern. But if you think about that the seesaw effect, actually what happens if you engage these values, it's going to suppress those ones. So yeah, the idea of trying to do both doesn't really work. It crowds out the broader community values.
So do you wind up then with confused target audiences who maybe don't respond?
Well, I think, so if you're doing recruitment and things like that, I think you'd end up with people turning up with a different disposition, for instance, and a different motivation for being part of, you know, your things. So yeah, so it's really thinking about what are the values, what are the sort of frames that you use in terms of making sense of the offering, so that when people are showing up, they're showing up with that in mind. You're welcome.
I've got a question. Last time you presented, from memory, you were talking about how you'd embedded this at ACF. Can you talk for a minute about that and what that process was actually like?
Yep. So ACF, so the Australian Conservation Foundation, so it's about unity with nature, protecting the environment, etc. And very much about a broader sense of creating a better world for all living things. So people, critters, the whole lot. And what we did is we basically did a sort of literature review and a discourse analysis. So looked at what was happening in terms of the public discourse. And often what you find is a lot of the conversations were around here. And it's fair to say that the vast majority, I think, of our federal conversations are very much in this space, in security space. So what we were looking at ACF is how we really strongly engage these values and also the self-direction values. And, you know, that involves things like how do you encourage a sense of curiosity about what's around you. Creativity, so when you're thinking about particular activities and things like that, how we build creativity into it and encourage people to have more generative conversations rather than closed conversations. So we developed a whole series of strategies, if you like, about talking to collective action, so not talking necessarily to individual action, but talking to the power of the collective, and also significantly change the way in which, as an organisation, ACF described, or people from ACF described the organisation. So an example is, rather than saying the environment, so the environment for a start is already creating an othering, so the environment, somewhere over there. So we used a much more descriptive elemental approach. So we talk about the trees and the rivers and the forests, the birds. It all makes sense, doesn't it? You know, think the way in which people experience the environment in a very elemental sense. And yeah, there's a series of strategies in terms of the sort of collective story and what that meant in terms of the invitation to be part of a group of people creating change, a community of people creating change. So just one word on celebrities, because that often comes up a bit. I mentioned before about in 2009, I think it was, actually no, maybe it was a bit later, there was a campaign which had Cate Blanchett and Michael Caton fronting it, basically for a price on carbon. And what was interesting was there was a view that you needed celebrities, someone with public profile to give it lift, etc., which is fairly normal view. And what we did is we certainly knew and understood Cate Blanchett's commitment to the environment. So the fact that she is very committed to the environment, very committed obviously in terms of her artistic expression, creativity, etc. So we totally saw herself and Michael Caton as fantastic spokespeople and fantastic people to have involved in this particular campaign, which also had a range of other people as well, I should hasten to add. But what happened in terms of the media is they were absolutely able to wedge the campaign, because most people do not necessarily understand their commitment in that respect. They probably see ambition and success and red carpets and things like that. So it's just a word of caution that if you go down the sort of high profile people route or celebrity route, is actually really thinking about and really understanding that there's a match between the values that you're engaging and how people understand that person as well in the context of those values. Because for us, for the whole alliance that was working on this, it very quickly derailed the work of the campaign, what we're trying to do. And it was really, really unpleasant for Cate Blanchett, so that was not good.
Can you think of any examples where those celebrity type things have really worked, and where have you seen?
Yeah, so Rosie Batty, for instance, is a great person to be talking about her experience and her care and concern. There's a lot of musicians that it works really well. I think the main thing is thinking about how people are understood and known in the broader context from their experience of life, and that it's consistent and coherent with what you're talking about.
And do you think people get a bit blinded by their success or
Totally.
their material? They just can't go past the fact that
Yeah.
it doesn't really matter what their values are because they live in a fancy house.
Yeah, exactly, and that's the trouble. That's the trouble with it, is that
They get paid to do that or something. That's maybe the perception that people think they got used as an image
yeah.
to promote this cause. Is that what people think as well? Or is that?
Yeah, so it's so for example, the Make Poverty History campaign. So the way this extends is, if you think about that campaign, they had a whole lot of celebrity concerts. They had the wristbands, all that sort of stuff. And what they found in analysing that campaign in a particular country was that it actually amplified consumerist values. It didn't build concern for the very issues that they were talking about. And I would imagine that part of what's driving that is the sort of tactics they were using of celebrities and adornment as a way of expressing concern for an issue. So it's just something that really needs careful thought, because often the motivation for engaging celebrities and people of high profile is that you think, well, it's going to give you profile, but it might not give you profile in the way that actually helps what you're trying to do. You might be better off taking a very different approach.
When you're looking to use these values, is there a magic number? Like, is there like, should you take one from, the 3 areas you want to focus on, or is it better to focus on one area?
No, there's no magic number.
No advice on that. Just use whatever.
It's generally easier, like I find in terms of, when you think about different things, it's generally easier to think about a value and start to brainstorm through that value. But you might, for instance, go, and this can be quite interesting as well, is if you choose one from each segment and see how it changes. If you're developing communications, for instance, see how it changes the way in which you think about that piece of communication, or if you think about a particular tactic. But yeah, if you're thinking about campaigns and things like that, you might actually choose a cluster of, curiosity, creativity, a world of beauty, and imagine a whole range of different things, how you do events in a way that actually engage those values.
We've, I think I mentioned to you last time, we've been using them in our brand work because a lot of organisations have the same values: trust, respect, honesty, what have you. And what we've found using these, and what we do is an exercise, we just get everybody to select those that they most relate to. And we often find there's 5 or 6 that really stand out across a group of employees in an organisation. And so we kind of use those and then create a whole lot of, spiels, statements around each one and present them back to them. And then we find people start to actually question, are they valid, are they the right ones or not? What we often find too is that when we get people to think about the organisation, they often think of the organisation down in the extrinsic security, tradition, conformity, but when they think about themselves, it's all up in the intrinsic. Which I've found an interesting kind of shift, because we actually say, so what are the most important values to the organisation today, and what are the most important going forward? And so that's how they separate. It's, wealth and security are important today, and whether that's the organisation or whether that's how they think about their clients, it can kind of tease that apart sometimes. But yeah, there's often that split between what they think today and where they think in future.
Do you give them a list, or
we give them that list?
You give them that.
So we just give them that list that Ange put up, the black and white list without any of the overlay. And we give them a list of the descriptions, and then we just ask them to go through and select the top 6 that are relevant today and the top 6 that they think are relevant moving forward.
And how often do you do that process?
Every time we do a brand project.
So every time you've got a project or something, you do a values analysis?
No, whenever we just go into either look at rebranding an organisation. So we might get called in because they've got a new CEO, or they've just decided the organisation's 30 years old and they need to kind of relook at it. So it might just be a refresh of the existing kind of, initially it starts as, we need a new logo, can you come in and have a look? And so we'll build it into that process. Or if it's a new program, we'll then use this model to try and understand what the values are that sit behind the program. Because we use for brand work, we're using a model called archetypes, which is basically around human personality types. And so this fits really nicely within that, because once you've got an identity for a particular character, then you can attach values into what that is and what it actually means at an organisational level. I was wondering, you were talking about the bracelets and does that actually attach into that sort of social recognition and sense of belonging, and that's why people are buying them more than any intrinsic kind of value?
Yeah, so that's I think the challenge is because it so overwhelmingly activates in that space that if you're trying to build concern about social and environmental issues, it's taking you to there. So the other example that is very present is when you think about the public discourse on immigration and asylum seekers. So an example of that is the department was the Department of Immigration and Citizenship until 5 years ago, I think. Yeah, so it was very much up in this space, and now it's, border protection, home security. So if you actually look at the way in which the description of the department is written now, it's really strongly in national security, social order, belonging. So if you think about that axis I talked about before in terms of openness to change and not, and then spillover effect. So yeah, that's quite a dramatic change.
From the point of view of using the values inside an existing organisation, are there a couple of steps that you think should be embedded into policy or procedure as to how you go about using this approach?
Yeah, so one thing that you can do is, so like what Mike was saying, just in terms of, pose a question. So if you imagine a society that cares about XYZ, your agenda or the issues that you're working on, what values would be strong and what would be weak? And so then you typically end up with identifying a set of values that would be strong and those that would be weak. And then what you can start to do is look at what is the lived experience of your organisation with your different stakeholder groups. So you really quickly start to see policy, procedures, it might be recruitment approaches, for instance. It could be the way in which you engage your stakeholders through particular experiences. It could be different communication methods and things like that that you use. And then you can start to shift those and reframe those. So one example with recruitment is if you're out and about, if you're at a social situation, what's the first question someone asks you? Yeah, what do you do? So imagine if rather than we were repeatedly asked, what do we do, if the question was actually more about who are we? What's our story? Why are you here? And you're repeating that. So if you think about that in the context of recruitment, for instance, where it is really orientated towards some of these values, and actually if you shifted it to that, you'd probably get a different person showing up, or you'd get someone showing up with a different context. So in terms of one way to start to think about how you might change some things is similar to what Mark was outlining, is identifying the values that will be strong and weak. There's another chart that is basically lived experience, and it talks about different intervention points and just identifying some of those intervention points and then thinking about what they look like through a different values lens and different framing effect. And it is often the case where you start to see what is wrong and you can't see what is right. So that's quite a natural thing as well, where you start to notice, oh my gosh, we use consumer all over the place, or, we talk about feeding the economy, for instance. So that's quite natural as well to see that initially before you can actually see the way through it.
So you mentioned the bracelets before. I presume you're talking about the rubber bands where people print some sort of...
Yeah, exactly.
So you're identifying with a particular charity, or the ribbons and stuff that people are wearing.
Yeah.
So you're saying that's more appealing to social recognition than it is to the charity that they're identifying with.
That's
so
right.
It's a counterproductive strategy.
Yeah.
And that's interesting.
Yeah. So it's a classic...
So poppies and Remembrance Day poppies and
that'd be interesting.
Badges and all that sort of stuff. That here's a $2 donation to indicate your support.
Yeah. So I think the poppy one I think would be interesting, because I suspect how people make sense of that is probably quite different. But if you're talking about, so the example in terms of this particular bit of research was on Make Poverty History, the white wristbands, and it found that it engaged consumerist values, not actual social concern about the issue. And part of that would be the way in which people are sold the wristbands. There'd be a whole range of contributing factors. But if you're using tactics that are activating people's, that are activating the sense of consumer as opposed to citizen, then you're going to be very much in that space.
It's interesting. The organisation I represent is connected to a funds management business. It's a charity attached to funds management, which are either side of the seesaw. One's wealth management and the other one's benevolence.
So what's the purpose for the wealth management?
To create wealth.
Does it stop at that? Is that what?
What are people using the wealth for?
Well, for whatever their own personal needs are, I guess. But
Yeah. So it probably does, yeah.
yeah, but
Yeah.
I guess that's our way of trying to balance it by creating a foundation where we can be doing the benevolent thing. And we're saying to these people, well, you've created some wealth, now use some of that wealth to do good.
Yeah, so that's...
Are we actually fighting a losing battle doing that?
No, well, you're
or
not
is it
fighting a
actually
losing
the
battle,
right strategy
but
to
you
try
want
and
to be...
balance it?
No, I don't think it's necessarily about balancing. It's, yeah, you're in a bit of a seesaw. Yeah, but it's more about how you tell that as an overarching story as a purpose for people's wealth. So you're really appealing to their benevolent side to engage those values.
Or do you more engage with them, like if we recognise achievement, instead of going up here, you actually deal with the security?
No, that would take you into an unhelpful space, I reckon.
You'd probably want to talk around achievement in terms of personal and security in terms of their personal life, but then bring in the intrinsic values around how they can suddenly use that wealth to become more engaged citizens. Rather than consumers, you could go down that path of talking about their ability to now participate in society because they don't have those financial pressures to be thinking about.
Yeah, so you'd be...
Because, I'm just thinking, like with high net worth individuals, having a discussion with them about national prosperity, neighbourhoods doing well and that sort of thing, is all around that social order, those sorts of things. So I'm interested in, because you
I don't think that's helpful.
You don't think it's helpful?
No.
But then that's what a lot of charities that are dealing with homelessness and housing and that sort of thing will have those discussions.
Yep.
Yep.
That's exactly it.
So you think
saying
the current? So you think the current thing that the council for homelessness are running at everybody's home, and their 5 points is unhelpful?
I'm not familiar with that one.
Okay, so it looks at that one looks at on five sorts of things. One is about investment in this country. Like that 1 in 3 houses are investments versus home ownership. The other one around so taxation issues. One around the need for social housing. And then there's the three other areas. One about if you find yourself homelessness, the need for responsive services and wraparound services and some other things. So to me, they're dealing with that security piece and engaging,
the way you describe it to me sounds more like it's benevolence.
What's the call to action in it, Georgia?
The current call to action is get involved in the public campaign sign up.
Right, okay.
So there's no end goal other than...
Well, the end goal is a political discussion and engaging people in a discussion that it's not around necessarily having a big discussion around investment and engaging that piece.
Yeah, so the way you're describing it to me sounds more like it's in the benevolent space, but you do see a lot of campaigns that are actually in this particular space, which is not helpful because it's closing people in. It's not actually creating an openness and a giving nature, for instance. So the other way that you can look at it is around sort of independence, freedom, curiosity, etc. So an example would be with the conversations you hear about energy, so the public conversations about energy are very much in security. So the National Energy Guarantee is very much in that security space, which is not helpful. Well, it's not helpful if you're wanting to build concern for the environment and climate change. You could actually have a conversation that is much more around freedom and independence. That's, about your own home becoming your own, your neighbourhood's power station or something like that. I'm not a copywriter, that's really bad, but you know what I mean? Like, you know, so you could, you know, choosing your own goals, for instance, there's ways that you could express it through that. But there are a lot of charities that operate in this space, and it's not helpful in terms of getting greater engagement on social issues. And particularly, so what you were saying just then about getting involved in the public conversation and advocacy.
Yeah.
So this is.
I mean, I'm not running the campaign. We're contributing into the campaign.
Yeah.
But it's just interesting how they've gone about it.
Yeah, and you do see that a lot. Like, you see it a lot, but this is where the behaviour and attitudes are in terms of civic engagement. So they're the values that need to be connected. Yeah, but like I said before, it's easier to see kind of where things are not necessarily helping, and it's often more difficult to imagine how you recast that in a way that's helpful. So the swing tags that I showed you before, so what would you do to change that? Yeah.
Kids in trees.
Yeah, exactly.
What do you do with the tree?
Yeah, exactly. What do
Exactly.
you remember about the tree?
Yeah, so if you think about that, it was a price tag that was, so even just that price tag says something.
Whereas you see trees in streets with ribbons and that sort of thing around it, so it's a bit more.
Yeah, yeah, so there's a whole range of ways.
They give you rather than a cost tag.
Put a free hug sign on.
Yeah, exactly. Or, you know, or you could just turn it into, like, rather than a price tag, swing tag, it could just be a tag that says something about, you know, this tree was planted when XYZ happened, or something like that, so it primes curiosity in people. Or, you know, you could prime creativity about the different ways that people see the tree. Did people see that story from the Melbourne City Council about the arborists with the tree email addresses? So there was basically every public tree in the City of Melbourne has an email address, and it became known amongst the public, some people in the public. And what happened is people started writing emails to particular trees that they would see in their day-to-day life. So there's all these really beautiful stories of, you know, people saying, I found out I was going to be a dad when I was standing near you on my smoko break or whatever, and I walk past you every day and I see your leaves change and blah, blah, blah. And it's really fascinating, like, just all these different conversations. But I mean, that's a classic example of, you know, the perception gap. So people are intrinsic by nature, predominantly intrinsic by nature, and left to sort of a broader framework will actually very naturally engage in that way.
Can you start in one frame and move to another? So could you start in security and move to universalism, or once you start?
So that used to be the. You know, when I first started reading Common Cause, actually, there was kind of a discussion about, well, maybe you can do a bit of a seesaw. You know, you can start here and then sort of toggle across. And the argument then was that most organisations that are working on cause-related don't have the sheer resources available to do that, to do, you know, a sort of approach which starts here and then toggles across. But since more of the evidence suggests that if you engage these values, they're going to crowd out anyway, those values.
And
people lose sight of what you're talking about. Yeah, exactly. And it's probably because, in terms of crowding out, you know, if these are the dominant values that we perceive in our broader society, they're probably more easily activated. So if you think about that list of Australian values where security was 3, you know, that's an easily activated value in our society.
Can I ask how does positive psychology then sit in this? So, you know, no, because I'm just interested, because people are like, you know, you use positive psychology to be successful. You know, so it's like, it's sort of that, when you look at it this way, it's sort of like, where does all that rhetoric and...
Yeah, so it's not really, it doesn't really sort of sit within it. So I guess one of the, so we're not saying, for instance, only tell sort of positive good news stories. What we're saying is deeply engage with the values that support the mission and causes that you work on. So for instance, on climate change, the way that that starts to look is that you don't shy away from the truth of what the science says, but you make sure that the story and the narrative is plausible in terms of people's role and how they can play a role, an effective role. And also it's commensurate with the scale of what you're talking about. So often what will happen is people will, a lot of the environmental communications will be in this space and they'll talk about threat, etc., which will just push people straight away to there. So yeah, it's not necessarily linked to positive psychology in that respect. Lovely, thank you.
Any other questions? No?
What do you call this?
The circumflex.
Circumflex.
Yeah, or the Schwartz values map is the other one. So we'll send out some things, some materials after this presentation. So yeah, if you want to do some more reading and things like that. But one of the things to do is just to start noticing, like just sort of start to notice how people express things around you or what you see in the media, and think about, well, what are the motivations it's tapping into? What are the values that are being activated? And I think on, I think it was Radio National at the start of the week, it might have been. I think it was Christopher Pine that was talking about jobs and growth came up again. And yeah, it was jobs and growth, security, I can't remember what the third one was, but yeah, it was really here, really, really strongly here.
Have you ever presented to political groups?
Yeah, so we've done some work with political groups, Yeah, and it is, so I think one of the interesting challenges for politics and campaigns is often it is actually in power, and even though the causes are about the collective, the way in which it's expressed is often power over. So it can be a bit confused sometimes. So yeah, that is a challenge. Because, you know, if you're seeing a lot of expression of authority and social power, power over others, and yet you're talking to a better society or a better world or whatever it is, they can be in conflict.
Do you get conflicted?
No, I don't think so. I think when I was mentioned before about my sort of journey from advertising into the work that I'm doing now, there were definite moments now when I look back and think actually what was going on was this deep conflict of the values, where, you know, I would often quite deliberately think I have to check myself at the door and I'll reconnect, you know, when I come out at 8 that night or whatever, you know, because there were things that you would need to accept. So, you know, certainly at that point you couldn't say that you wouldn't work on particular bits of business. It was kind of, yeah, you worked on whatever clients. Yeah, and, you know, and life is a dance around this map as well. So there are times when, you know, in terms of activation, you know, we will all be in a whole range of different spaces. But the question is really if you're, you know, looking to create a better world in whatever that looks like, that it's, you know, we're going to do it faster if we're activating values that build that long-term concern. Good luck.
Questions at all?
I didn't have a question, I just wanted to say thank you, that was really helpful.
Oh, great. Excellent. You're welcome. It's a pleasure. Yeah. You're very, very welcome.
Thanks, everybody.